Everyone says you are strong. Everyone praises you for being understanding. From childhood to adulthood, you were given those words like a shining medal, one no one ever asked whether it was too heavy for a child to carry. They saw your silence and called it maturity. They watched you handle everything on your own and called it resilience. But no one knew that what they thought was strength was merely a thin layer of skin growing too quickly to cover a wound that had never been tended to. And perhaps even you have forgotten that. All you know is that you must be fine, always fine. Even when your heart longs, just once, to lay itself down, to be held by someone who would say, "You don't have to be this strong." It always begins quietly. Like a crack no one notices, not even you, just a faded memory, still sharp enough to cut into the present. A room larger than usual, and you, smaller than everything inside it. An adult standing there, the one you wanted to run to and cling to, like the only pillar in a storm. But their eyes drifted elsewhere, toward a place empty, heavy, and dark as the bottom of a void. Maybe it was sudden anger, maybe the smell of alcohol, maybe just the sigh of a soul exhausted beyond repair. You saw collapse in their eyes before you even understood what collapse meant. And in that moment, something in you quietly closed. No one told you what to do. No one assigned you a duty. But with the strange instinct of children forced to grow up too soon, you understood that you needed to shrink yourself to keep everything else standing. So you learned to be silent quickly. Learned to smile even when your throat tightened. Learned to walk softly, speak softly, even breathe softly as if your very existence had to be delicate enough to be invisible. You folded yourself into a shadow, not because you wanted to, but because you believed that other people's peace mattered more than your own fear. Your childhood slipped through your fingers like sand, not because you were mature, but because you were forced to compress yourself just enough to fit inside the pain of the adults around you. You never had a sky for innocence, never had a space to need someone, never had the privilege to be afraid. You stood beside your own life like an observer rather than someone allowed to live in it. The worst part is, no one knew. No one noticed a child quietly cracking apart. They only saw obedience, understanding, that remarkable maturity beyond your years. Each compliment was another heavy brick pressed onto your small chest as you struggled to keep it from trembling with worry. You loved the adults in that house so much, loved them to the point you forgot you were only a child. Perhaps that is the very first wound. You loved them by bending yourself out of shape. You believed that if you were a little more obedient, a little less needy, a little stronger, then they would be okay. But what child understands that the collapse of adults is never theirs to carry? All you saw was their pain, and you chose to disappear so their suffering could have more room to breathe. And so you grew up leaning slightly backward, as if always prepared to retreat from any conversation, any relationship, any moment that might risk disappointing someone. You mistook it for personality, for natural maturity. But truly, it was only the echo of the day your childhood quietly folded its wings. No sound, no explanation, no witness. Just a child trying to hold the world together by sacrificing themselves, with no one ever stepping forward to say, "You don't have to carry all of that." If there is something called compassion, it is not compassion for others, but for that very moment. The moment you shrank your own soul to fit inside an adult's sorrow, a price no child should ever have to pay. There was a time when you truly believed you were strong, that your silence was a choice, that handling everything on your own was simply who you were. You lived many years with that belief, as if it were your natural skin, rather than a garment you were forced to wear far too early. But then, slowly and quietly, small cracks began to appear, not from grand upheavals, but from the most ordinary moments. A day when you suddenly felt tired without knowing why, an evening when sitting still made your chest feel hollow. A simple question, "Are you okay?" that made your throat tighten because you didn't know how to answer. That was when you began to realize. Perhaps you had been living a script that wasn't yours. Perhaps that strength was never a choice, it was a reflex. Perhaps that maturity was just the way you learned not to trouble anyone. And perhaps, deep inside, you never truly believed you had the right to be loved in your softest form. The first thing you recognize is always the exhaustion. Not the kind that drains the body, but the kind that burdens a soul that has braced itself for too long. A tiredness so deep you no longer know where to lean. You ask yourself why you always feel lost in moments of peace. Why, when life finally calms, you grow uneasy. Why your heart feels like a small bird perched on the edge of its nest, too afraid to loosen its wings. And then you understand, peace is unfamiliar to you. It is foreign, like a language you were never taught. Stillness, instead of making you safe, makes you alert because your mind has learned that after the quietest moments, the storm usually comes. That is the moment the mask begins to crack. Not because you wish to remove it, but because it has become too tight. You have grown too much, yet the mask is still the size of the child who once tried to save the world by shrinking themselves. And now that you're older, your true face can no longer fit inside that old shell. Each time you try to be fine, you feel a thin tension spreading across your chest. Each time you smile to reassure someone, you hear a small sound like something splintering inside your heart. What once was your strength has become your prison. What once protected you now suffocates you. You begin to see more clearly what you once avoided. That you are not as skilled at loving yourself as you believed. That you are not independent in the sense of freedom. You simply do not trust that others will stay if you need them. That you strive so hard not to progress, but to avoid being left behind. And the most painful truth, you are always afraid of being a burden, even though no one has ever told you that you are. That moment of realization is both cruel and liberating. Cruel because it forces you to revisit your childhood without warning, to face the price you paid. Liberating because for the first time in many years, you finally see a truth no one ever told you. You were not born to be this strong. You simply lived in an environment where you had no other choice. Realizing this doesn't change you instantly, but it makes you pause, place a hand over your chest, and whisper a small truth. Perhaps you have been living out of fear more than out of love, and that is the beginning, the place where you start to loosen yourself from the old shadow and finally see the self that has been quietly waiting for you to return. There is a kind of pain that doesn't arrive with the scream of tragedy, but with a silence that stretches across years. A silence you once thought you were familiar with as a child, yet when adulthood comes, it returns in a different form. A vague emptiness in your chest, a heaviness on your shoulders, a tear slipping down your face without a clear reason. And there, you begin to realize the pain does not live in the present. It is the echo of a childhood forced to perform a role far too big for a body far too small. You see that for many years you lived like a natural-born actor, not acting to impress, but to survive, to avoid an adult's anger, to keep peace in a fragile house, to never disappoint anyone. You played the role of the strong child, the understanding child, the child who can handle everything. And day after day, you inhabited those roles so completely that you yourself forgot what your real face looked like. In quiet nights, when every noise has faded, you suddenly realize you haven't cried in a very long time. Not because you didn't want to cry, but because you learned to silence your tears when you were far too young. You mastered the art of swallowing them, of steadying your trembling, of keeping your body upright even when your soul bent inward. You thought that was strength, but now, looking back, you see it was only a child trying to survive by shrinking their pain small enough to fit inside their heart. Then you come to a cruel realization. No one ever truly asked if you were okay, not because they lacked empathy, but because you acted too well. You became the child who needs nothing, who makes no demands, who never troubles anyone. But the cost of being so easy to love was that you were forgotten right inside your own family. You were never allowed to collapse, because the image of strength you wore convinced everyone that nothing could ever hurt you. The deepest pain isn't what happened, it's what you never dared to admit, that you were once profoundly lonely, and that loneliness never really left. It simply learned to grow quiet, just as you did. It stands behind you every time you smile to soothe someone else. It sits beside you each night as you try to comfort yourself with the thought that everything is fine. And in adulthood, that very loneliness becomes the lens through which you always see yourself as not enough, unworthy of love, not allowed to need anyone. It is a truth that arrives late, but cannot be avoided. Everything you thought was your personality, strength, independence, silence. Self-reliance was really just the performance of a child who was never given the right to be a child. And when that mask begins to crack, you finally see how many pieces of yourself you traded away just to survive. It hurts. Yes. But it is the pain of clarity. The pain of, for the first time in many years, not turning away from yourself. And within that pain lies something small yet vital. You begin to stop performing. There are moments in life that are not loud, yet powerful enough to make you stop, as if someone has just placed a hand on your shoulder. A thoughtless remark from someone. A moment when you look at yourself in the mirror and cannot recognize the eyes staring back. A night too quiet, where you lie down and suddenly understand. Perhaps you have been living far away from yourself for far too long. Not distant because of busyness, but because you lost something soft and true within you along the path of growing up. Truth rarely arrives like lightning. It comes as a thin light slipping through a crack in the door. You cannot see it clearly, but you can feel it. A bit of confusion, a small tightness in the throat, a subtle yet deep tug of war inside you. Why am I always tired when I'm simply being myself? Why do I still feel lonely even when I'm loved? Why does the harder I try to be strong, the emptier I feel? And then you begin to recognize what your mind once avoided. Everything you thought was your personality, your excessive kindness, your endurance, your readiness to please, your ability to read the room before anyone even speaks. None of it was who you are. It was the cost. The cost a child once paid to hold on to connection with the adults around them. Because back then, you understood instinctively that to be loved, you had to become the most lovable version of yourself. That is the deepest awakening. When you see clearly that the strength that once saved you has become the prison that confines you, that in order to be kept close by others, you once traded away the truest parts of yourself, that you learned to live like a mirror, always reflecting the desires of others, instead of like a soul with needs, fears, boundaries, and a voice of its own. At the deepest place of awakening, you come to understand a principle no one ever taught you, but life forced into your bones from childhood. Children will always choose attachment over authenticity, because authenticity may upset adults, but losing attachment threatens the child's survival. And so you learn to turn off the parts that could inconvenience others. Your weakness, your confusion, your longing to be held, your fragility. You learn to adjust your face, your voice, your presence, to ensure you wouldn't give anyone a reason to walk away. But anything buried for too long will eventually wake. It does not want to destroy you. It only wants to return. It knocks against the inside of your chest each time you force a smile. It tugs at your sleeve whenever you overextend yourself. It whispers in your ear every time you say, "I'm fine," while every cell inside you is screaming, "I'm exhausted." Awakening is the moment you stop ignoring that voice. When you realize that your essence, the truest, softest, the most original part of you, never disappeared. You only hid it away to stay safe. And now it wants to step out, not to demand repayment, but to give back something you have lacked for far too long. The right to be yourself, the right to be small, the right to be honest with your emotions without fearing abandonment. Awakening does not turn you into someone else. It simply returns you to who you were before you had to trade your truth to hold on to someone's love. And in the moment you dare to look straight at that reality, you begin to see a new path wider and brighter than the one you had been walking with your head down for so many years. This is not a transformation. This is a homecoming. There was a long stretch of your life when you believed you were not allowed to fall, that if you weakened even a little, everything around you would collapse, that if you ever said, "I'm not okay," there would be no one left to hear whatever came next. But then, at some point, when you had grown too tired to keep pretending, your body began to breathe differently, and your soul whispered a sentence it had never dared to say. "I can't keep going like this." Falling is not the moment you collapse. It is the moment you stop forcing yourself to stand. Stop pretending to be fine. Stop swallowing tears before they reach your eyes. Stop shrinking your heart to fit the expectations of others. Falling is when you place a hand over your chest and realize it hurts so much you cannot endure another ounce of pressure. And what makes it hurt is not weakness, but the fact that you have been strong for far too long. When awakening touches a wound, Everything you once suppressed rises to the surface like a thin foam of memories. You see your inner child, small, lost, standing in that old room with wide eyes, trying to understand why no one turned back to hold them. And in a moment so quiet, so delicate, you recognize that child never left. They have simply been standing there, waiting for you to return, waiting for you to look at them without turning away, without standing tall, without being resilient. Falling is when you stop defending the adults of your past and begin defending that child instead. When you finally dare to admit that back then, you were hurting, you were scared, you were far too small to carry things that never belonged to you. You didn't understand why silence felt safer than crying. You didn't know that your goodness was not virtue, it was the only strategy you had to hold on to connection. And when that truth finally rises, you find yourself wanting to cry not out of weakness, but because for the first time, you are allowed to cry. You want to be held. You want someone to place a hand on your head and say, "You've endured so much." But no one comes. And then you understand something both painful and beautiful. The person who needs to hold that child is you. Falling is not losing control. Falling is returning to the true weight of your soul. It is ceasing to force yourself to be stronger than necessary. It is opening a small crack for light to touch the part of your heart that has long been forgotten. It is the first time in your life you don't run from the pain, but sit beside it like an old friend. And in that fall, something strange happens. You don't dissolve. You don't break. You simply become real, become human, become whole in a way you had never dared to try before. Not by standing tall, not by bracing yourself, not by pretending, but by being yourself for the first time in so many years. Because sometimes, to truly rise, one must first allow oneself to fall. There is something strange that happens when you allow yourself to fall. You don't hit the bottom the way you always feared. Instead, you reach yourself, the part of you you've avoided for years. And in that moment, a strange stillness opens. Not the stillness of running away, but the stillness of returning home. You see that child more clearly than ever, no longer blurred, no longer hiding behind all the strong roles you used to play. They stand right there close, real with wide, cautious eyes. A child who has grown too familiar with soothing themselves just to survive. A child who learned not to ask, not to inconvenience, not to cry too loudly for fear someone might leave. You see them tremble as you look directly at them, as if they cannot believe someone has finally come back for them after all this time. And in that slow, steady breath, you realize a truth you were never peaceful enough to see before. That child never needed you to be strong. They only needed you to stay. They don't need you to prove anything, don't need you to save the world, don't need you to say the perfect words. They only need an embrace, a hand placed gently on their back, whispering, "You've been so lonely." Holding your inner child is not some poetic gesture you read in books. It is the awkwardness of not knowing how to comfort them. It is the tightness in your throat when you realize you made them wait too long. It is the bittersweet ache of understanding that you were once hurt enough to bury yourself that deeply. But slowly, you step closer. You no longer push them away like before, no longer tell them to be quiet, no longer urge them to be strong. You simply walk toward them and let them see that this time, you are not leaving. And strangely, when you take one step, they take one too. When you open your heart, they exhale, as if finally ending the lifelong vigil they've kept since childhood. To embrace is to place your hand over your own heart where that child still lives, and speak the words no one ever said to you. You are not wrong. You were never meant to be abandoned. You deserve love even when you're tired, when you cry, when you're weak. And the most beautiful part of this journey is not the comfort itself. It is the moment you realize that child never needed anyone else but you. Not the love your parents didn't know how to give, not the understanding the world offered too late, but you, the only one who could walk inside and unlock the door they had closed for so long. Embracing your inner child is the first step of healing. Not healing the pain, but healing the abandonment. Not fixing the past, but returning to yourself the right to be soft, to be real, to need others without fearing that you will lose them. From here, the true healing begins. Not through strength, but through the gentleness you have never given yourself. There is something strange that happens when you begin to embrace the child within. You suddenly see how they have been quietly steering every decision you make in the present. Not through words, but through reflexes you once believed were your personality. You realize the pain never disappeared. It simply grew up with you, becoming the emotional habits you never knew you had carried your entire life. You notice you overreact when someone goes silent, not because the present moment is frightening, but because silence used to signal a storm long ago. You realize you always try to keep everyone pleased, not because you enjoy accommodating others, but because the child inside you once believed that even the smallest mistake could make love leave. You hesitate to ask for help because long ago you learned that your needs were an inconvenience. You fear being misunderstood because, since childhood, you were trained to be perfect, so you would never become a burden. And in each of these moments, you see the shadow of that old child standing at the wheel, their small hands trembling, trying desperately to keep everything safe. Not because they want control, but because no one ever taught them that the world is no longer as dangerous as the one they grew up in. They still think you are 7 years old. They still think the weight is on their shoulders. They don't know you've grown, that you now have the strength to stand without curling up in fear. Healing is not erasing the pain. It is seeing what the pain is doing to you. It is the moment you exhale and say to the child, "It's okay now, let the adult handle it." It is when you pause in the middle of an old reflex, avoiding, pleasing, growing silent, bracing yourself and realize, this is not the you of today. This is the child of yesterday trying to protect you. And the extraordinary thing is this: the moment you recognize this, the reaction begins to soften. No force needed, no resistance, no need to become someone else. You only need to see, because what is seen will start to change on its own. The wounded child no longer needs to grip the wheel once they know you are here, awake, strong enough to take over your own life. Healing, too, is the moment you finally understand that your old weakness was never your fault. Your fear was not your nature. Your hyper-vigilance was not your identity. You were simply carrying a child who never had the chance to rest. When you place your hand over your heart and say, "From now on, let me take care of you," something inside you softens. Reactions that were once hard as stone begin to melt. Anxieties that once clenched your chest loosen and let a breath through. And the moments you once blamed yourself for become moments you can now hold with rare compassion. Healing is not an ending. It is a movement from unconsciousness to awareness, from reflex to choice, from a wounded child to an adult capable of loving themselves. And that is when you know your pain does not fade because you defeat it, but because you finally look at it with eyes that no longer abandon. There is a strangely tender moment in the healing journey. You suddenly realize you are no longer who you once were, yet not fully who you are becoming. You stand in the space where two versions of yourself meet: the wounded child you once were, and the adult who is learning to love themselves now and for the first time. Instead of conflict or a struggle for control, those two parts begin to look at each other with a rare softness. Integration is not the disappearance of the wound. It is when the wound stops speaking in screams and begins to whisper, "This is where I once hurt." It no longer asks you to cover it. It no longer drives your life from the shadows. It simply exists as a part of your history, no longer a compass directing how you must live. When you touch it, it softens. When you look at it without turning away, it stops frightening you. You realize that you are not meant to fix the pain, but to learn how to live beside it without losing your peace. A quiet serenity arrives slowly, yet undeniably. You no longer need to be strong all the time. You no longer need to prove your worth through endurance. You no longer need to hold yourself together in silence. You no longer need to race against invisible expectations. You are no longer the child who must predict everyone's emotions to stay safe. You are you, an adult with the right to choose, the right to err, the right to rest, the right to step back without fearing abandonment. And the most miraculous thing is this: when you start doing small things for yourself, smiling genuinely when you're happy, saying no when you're tired, letting someone hold you when you're vulnerable, you realize the world does not collapse the way it once did in your childhood. It remains standing, and so do you. The child within no longer has to rush out and protect you. They get to sit down, to play, to be a little foolish. and you step forward with the posture of someone who knows they deserve a gentler life. Integration is also the moment you realize you do not need to erase your past to have a future. You only need to return to yourself the right to choose how you live from today onward. No longer living by survival reflexes, but by the truth of your soul. You do not need to become a perfect version of yourself, only a softer one, a lighter one, a freer one, a version who can place a hand over their chest and say, "Here is home too, here is safe too." A version who does not run from pain, but also does not let pain lead the way. And then, as you sit in a quiet room and take a deep breath, you finally understand what this long journey has been trying to tell you. Once, you had no choice. But today, you get to choose again. You get to choose how to love yourself. You get to choose how to live differently. You get to choose to step out of the unconscious patterns and rewrite your story in the language of peace. Serenity is not the end point. It is the beginning of a new life. One where you no longer exist just to survive, but live to finally be yourself.